I am here with Annie Whitehead, award-winning author and historian specializing in the early medieval Anglo-Saxon period, particularly in Mercia. She has written numerous fiction and nonfiction books exploring the era, which is not very common. I usually see people do one or the other, like the insane respect that you're able to do both. I, in particular, I read this book and it's really cool. And so I asked her to come on and speak to us a little bit more. So thank you for joining us and taking time out of your day to talk to us.
Oh, it's lovely to chat to you.
So you specialize in pre-conquest or the Anglo-Saxon period of British history. So what drew you to that time period initially, and are there any things that you wish people understood more about it?
Yeah, so I studied it in depth for the first time really when I was doing my undergraduate degree. And it's just one of those classic stories. I had a lecturer who just really brought the whole period to life. There's a little bit of a romantic thing going on as well. I think that I found some of the characters so appealing. It is a very, in a way, I think people think of it as a foreign time because there's a language barrier and the names, although I find them huge. I mean, just think Aragorn, that's kind of sums up, the Lord of the Rings names. A lot of them are real Anglo-Saxon names, like Eomer, for example, was a real Old English name. So there is this sort of element of mystery and magic and myth, but they were real people. And although they spoke a different language, and I know we'll have problems with this throughout the conversation about the names and the difficulty of them, most of the language that you and I are talking right now derives from their language, their words, and all the words we have for common everyday items and even body parts comes from Old English, from Anglo-Saxon. So there is a deep connection for me, but also this otherness because of 1066. And I do get frustrated when they get lumped in with the rest of the medieval period. And these days there is a move towards calling it not so much the Anglo-Saxon era, but early medieval. But I must stress that early because there are huge cultural, language, legal differences pre and post 1066. But I just find them absolutely fascinating. I really do.
I very much feel that when you say like there's otherness to like it's kind of, it's most of what we think of as like the medieval period, like you dig into it and then I'm like, oh, this is actually the high medieval period or the late medieval period or the Renaissance, and then you go and you realize just how different the early medieval period was. And so it's a whole rabbit hole. This is why I've been hyperfixating on it, because it is so fascinating.
It is. I mean, you make a very interesting point, because when I'm reading books that just talk generically about the Middle Ages, and I immediately think, well, which century? Do you mean the 13th century, the 15th century, the 10th century? I mean, the whole Anglo-Saxon period from start to finish is like us going back to the Tudors. And so you can't say, and that's just the early medieval period, never mind that, the high Middle Ages. So it's like saying the Georgians have the same customs and mannerisms and cultures and beliefs as the Tudors or the Edwardians, so I think you need to draw more lines throughout one period rather than just calling it all medieval, because there were huge differences.
Like 1,000 years, I think, is how it's usually calculated, like the fall of the Roman Empire to roughly, however you want to say this, whenever you want to say the Renaissance started, like that's almost 1,000 years.
Yeah. Well, if you sort of said, well, say 450, give or take, for the Anglo-Saxon period to begin, and then I mean most people don't say that the Middle Ages finish until Battle of Osworth, 1485. So yeah, absolutely, 1,000 years, give or take. So I mean that's a huge amount of time.
You launched your writing career writing about, I'm so self-conscious about this name now, Aethelflaed, the lady of the Mercians.
Yes.
Mercians. I can pronounce this normally, I promise. But so we've talked a little bit about this, but what specifically drew you to write about her specifically, and how does she tie into, you have this tagline on your website, shining a light on the dark ages, and I love that line. So how does she tie into all of that?
I mean, just one thing I must say, when I first wrote the book, I did a quick Google search, and I was absolutely amazed that nobody else had written a novel about her life. I think there was one, a young adult novel, and I thought, why am I not piggybacking on loads of other authors who've already covered this subject? Because she's incredible. I mean, what a woman. So she leads a kingdom in a time of war in her own name, and she's a woman, and she's the only one really to have done that in this period and beyond. And yet she barely gets the name check in the chronicles. You know, the major part of the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, which sort of records the whole of this period, it calls her Edward's sister, King Edward of Essex's sister, doesn't even name her. So it just struck me as, you know, how did she do all this in a world that's clearly is a warrior society, it's male dominated, and yet seemingly nobody bats an eyelid. You know, what was it about her that made her so special? And not just her husband as well. He's a great character because he sort of literally rides onto the pages of history from nowhere. We don't know where he came from. We don't know who his parents were, but he was obviously highly respected. And the two of them come together. It's an alliance marriage. It's not a marriage of love. I don't think it could have been. And yet they form this power couple where they're joining the fight to fight back the Vikings. Her husband's working with her father and her brother, and then after he dies, she takes over, and nobody seems to mind that she's taken over. So the men of her council were clearly happy with the level of agency that she had. It's just an amazing story, and it gets better because she was succeeded by her daughter. Not for very long. After 6 months or so, her brother Edward came in and took his niece away. But, you know, there was that period where the Mercian council, presumably full of men, elected first one woman and then another. And I often say this, we don't have a woman leader succeeding a woman leader again in England until Tudor times. So, you know, it's an incredible achievement. And I think how she shines a light in the Dark Ages, I think, is because she stands out. She is an anomaly, but actually there's quite a few women like her. They didn't all achieve that kind of level, but they're doing amazing things. They're trailblazers, they're pioneers. And to go back to what we were saying about, I don't feel that, to the best of my knowledge, when I wrote my book, Women of Power in Anglo-Saxon England, that also hadn't been done. So you do get history books focusing on the women's stories and medieval women, but more often than not, the Anglo-Saxons, the early medieval women, that they're one chapter, and then we move on. And I think it's partly because they are separate, they are different. It's pre-1066, that made a huge difference. But I just feel we need to bring these women's stories out more because so little generally is known about them.
Yes, that is so true. I kept reading all of these books where they're like, also Anglo-Saxon women were really cool. And I'm like, is no one going to give me more on this? And so I think I just Googled like Anglo-Saxon women and your book came up and I was like, finally someone has gone in depth on this. I need this book. So thank you for writing this
you're welcome. It just proves when I was talking to the publishers, I said, I think this is a really good idea. Can we go with this? And they went, yes. So that's validation. That's vindication. Thank you.
Yes, it is. It's like I have that keeps happening as I've been trying to learn more about this period, where I just Google it, and then whatever comes up, it's like, well, I'm throwing myself on your mercy now. I hope that you've done your research. I'm trusting you. But in this book, Women in Power, you do touch on this, how women in Anglo-Saxon, how Anglo-Saxon women of the early medieval period had a greater level of autonomy in their time that wasn't, I think there's a quote, I forget who the quote's from, but how it wasn't really seen again until the modern era. And so, can you explain a little bit more about that for our audience and like what we mostly misunderstand about the Anglo-Saxon women?
Yeah, so I think first of all, I mean, obviously, I tried to present the book chronologically as well, and what you've got, yeah, I mean, incredibly, the earliest women, and we are talking about women of power, we are talking about the nobility, obviously, but it was the women who founded the abbeys and the monasteries, and they were the abbesses in the very very early portion of the period, nearly always royal women. They were in charge. And a lot of the abbeys in the early days were what was known as double houses. So monks and nuns, not necessarily living together. Sometimes there were sort of walls between their compounds, as it were. But these were double houses, monks and nuns, but run by the women, by the abbesses. And they had huge power. I mean, these were really, really huge estates, lots and lots of money. So you're talking almost like farm management, estate management, and then the women were in charge. And famously, St Hild of Whitby, who was a Northumbrian royal woman, she was said to have educated, I think it's no fewer than 5 bishops. So we've got women scribes. They're doing translations. They're writing histories. It's, you know, and I think that will come as a surprise to very many people. So there's the whole religious life situation going on. And then we've got in the 8th century, so a little bit later, again, an anomaly, but it happened. We've got a queen consort of Mercia who's got coins being minted in her own name. Now, as far as we know, she's the only one. But to go back to what you said about, you know, we have to wait again till the modern era. Well, queens, coins, that didn't happen until I think Henry VIII acknowledged, I think it was a couple of his wives on his coinage. It's not like they had their own separate coinage. So again, we're waiting a long time till we see any kind of this, anything like this happening again. And a friend of mine, Vanessa King, wonderful lady, great historian, she's made a really valid point recently that there's probably a very good reason for these coins having been minted. So this lady is Cynethryth, who's King Offa's wife. And I think everybody's probably heard of King Offa and his dyke, maybe not so much his wife. But Vanessa seems to think, and I agree, it's very plausible, that the reason Cynethryth had these coins minted was because she was ruling part of Offa's dominions for him. So that's a really interesting point. So again, a huge, great high level of power and agency. So there's that will probably surprise people. You know, Aethelflaed, yes, great achievement. We've got a wife of not even a king ruling Mercia, fighting back the Vikings. We've got Cynethryth, 2 centuries earlier. No, probably, sorry, my maths is terrible. Maybe about 150 years. Clearly ruling, maybe not in her own name, but she's got coins in her own name. And again, I can't stress often enough, this is a male-dominated, essentially still a warrior society, but these women are doing great things, and more often than not in their own right. We've got a great lady called Aethelflaed of Northampton, who was King Canute's first wife. He married again, but he didn't put her aside when he did that. He sent her off to rule Norway on behalf of their son. And it wasn't hugely successful, but it was remembered as Aethelflaed's time. So clearly she was remembered as being the one in charge. And I don't think we've got very many equivalents in the later medieval period of such women. What else can I tell you? Yeah, I think really, again, you know, the succession of the woman and the woman, that didn't happen until Tudor times. We've got the Empress Matilda during the Anarchy in the, what would that be, the 12th century. So she was named as her father's heir. King Henry I had no legitimate sons. But she really, really struggled because all the nobles, all the barons who had agreed in her father's lifetime to support her, then, as I understand it, very, very rapidly changed their minds. when her father died. So she really, really struggled, and ultimately she wasn't successful. So again, you think these Anglo-Saxon women, they are sort of, they're laying a trail that isn't really picked up for hundreds of years. So yeah, I really do feel we should talk more about them and know more about them, because they were doing amazing things within the constraints of the society at the time, but still doing what they could. Fantastic women, I think.
You talk about you do talk about Hilda Whitby in the book, and I was like, this is almost like I'm in the Bible Belt here, but in part of America, and I'm like, if a woman was in charge of a seminary here, they'd probably get upset. but like this is like in the well, I don't remember what century Hild lived in. Centuries and over 1,000 years ago.
Seventh, yeah.
7th century. So it's like 1,400 years ago ish, and she's hating bishops, and nobody's bothered. It's not a problem.
Yeah, yeah.
That blew my mind a little bit to realize that. And
yeah, I mean, these women did come up against the church at Canterbury, and a couple of them really had, a huge legal disputes with the church. But that's more to do with, as I said, that these were really, really lucrative estates, and land in those days was everything. So I think it was more to do with that. The church was saying, well, we want to have this abbey back, because they were actually, a lot of the properties, they literally owned them. They were their properties. So it's staggering. I think the things changed in the later period. There's a bit of a shift in church attitudes towards women. Around about the 12th century, things changed a little, and what you find is that the parish priest, and then you get priors rather than abbesses, and the double houses sort of they shut down, tailed off 8th, 9th century, but nearly all of the early ones were double houses, as I say, ruled by these royal women. And in the main, it was the kings who were converting. So obviously, when the early portion of the Anglo-Saxon period is pagan, we don't know much about that pagan religion, but we do have records of who converted and when. And it was the female members of that king's family who would then go and found the monasteries. But it was, almost always in that early period, the women who did it, which is just, it's mind-blowing, really, to think that it was the women who were in charge of these, as I say, huge estates, and ministering to their flock, as we would expect the men to do. But no, it was the women who did it.
So fascinating. This is why we study the early medieval Anglo-Saxon period, because there's all kinds of things like this. So, okay, so I'm gonna try to connect these two questions. So one thing, like you briefly touched on it, Aethelflaed fought with Ethelred against the Vikings, and one thing I have noticed is that it's very difficult to try and learn about the history of the Anglo-Saxons, the history of the Vikings, without, like, there's a lot of crossover in that history. Like, a lot of what we know comes from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So could you, for the sake of our audience, could you explain a little bit more about the relationship between what they would have called the Danes, the Vikings, and the Anglo-Saxons in Britain during this era?
Yeah, I mean, to begin with, it wasn't particularly cordial. Yeah. I mean, really, the first thing we hear, the huge event is the raid on Lindisfarne, and nobody on the English side came out of that particularly well. So you have this record of the Vikings. Actually, there's an earlier record about 40 years before that, where ships are seen on the horizon. This classic, the dragon boats are coming. And whoever went to meet them, I think it was a local reeve, didn't know who they were, and didn't really get a chance to find out, because they killed him, and that was that deemed to be the start of it. But the main raiding began in Northumbria, off the northeast coast, easy to get to. One of the earlier sites of Christianity. So we've got lots of abbeys and monasteries that have got lots and lots of silver and gold, which is quite appealing to the Danes, the Vikings. So there was that kind of period, and that's what we tend to think of as, the fire and the pillage and the rape and, all the rest of it. But eventually that changed. So we've got that's 793 was the raid on Lindisfarne that really kind of kicked it all off. And then we've got Alfred the Great fighting the Vikings, because they're not just raiding by the late 9th, early 10th century. They're overwintering, they're staying. We've got the arrival of the Great Army, great as in huge, and they're staying and they're making camps. And, famously Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons, is the last kingdom. I mean, I would dispute that because half of Mercia remained free as well. But I mean, I would say that, wouldn't I? I'm a Mercian champion. So we've got Alfred and his daughter Aethelflaed and her brother Edward fighting the Vikings. But they are, the territory that they're gaining, they're starting to settle it. And they stay. And so even though peace is eventually bought, essentially, and Athelstan, through various means, became, he's usually classed as the first king of England, so that's Alfred's grandson. But the Danes, they're there to stay. And so all of what was north and eastern Mercia, so the northeast Midlands, that remains pretty much Danish, to the point where it starts to be known as the Danelaw, and they literally keep their own laws. And we've got kings in the 10th century who are acknowledging that. And when they issue law codes, they issue different ones, so that the Danes can, I think that the quote is, can keep to their laws as they ever have done, or something like that. King Edgar even acknowledged the fact that the Danes and the Danelaw helped him when there was a little bit of some people call it a rebellion, some people say it was an agreement, but his slightly older brother was king for a wee while, and then Edgar became king and his older brother conveniently died. It's all a little bit murky, but the people who were living in the Danelaw were hugely supportive of Edgar, and he acknowledged that fact. So we've got, a sort of melting pot where you've got Danish settlers, and then you've got the Irish Norse coming across from their base in Dublin, and they're settling in the northwest, which is where I live. And a lot of the place names around very close to me reflect that, because they're derived from the Viking words for clearing and sheep farm. So you can see from the place names what happened. And they all lived together reasonably happily until Edgar, who acknowledged the Danes' help, had a son who's pretty famous because he's known to the world as Aethelred the Unready. It's not what it means. He wasn't unready. It means that he was badly counselled, but he didn't have the Viking raiding started again, essentially, in his reign, and he got very, very paranoid. There was a horrendous incident known as the St. Brice's Day massacre, where he got what we think was probably a bit of false intelligence about what was going on and ordered all the Danes slaughtered. Not all the Danes in the whole country, but there was, a nasty incident, and the Danes kept coming and they kept coming. And then under Canute, they stayed. Canute became king. But the whole nature of the Vikings, the Danes, again, that's changed because Canute was a Christian. So it's no longer a question of, the brave English Christians fighting off the heathens. Canute was Christian. He did a very, very astute thing because he married King Aethelred's widow. She was Emma of Normandy, but by this stage she's very much an English queen. She's the queen of the English people, if we can put it like that. And so he's consolidated his position. I mean, he wiped out all his rivals, but he also made sure that there was this sort of continuity. And again, you got, by the time of 1066, Battle of Hastings, King Harold Godwinson is half Danish himself. You know, there's a lot of Scandinavian influence at court. There had been a lot of Norman influence as well through Edward the Confessor's mother, that Emma of Normandy. So again, it's quite multicultural. Everybody's getting on reasonably well. And then the English and the Danes, of course, come together to fight the Normans at Hastings 1066. But it's not even that simple, because in a roundabout way, the Normans were Vikings anyway. So, you know, there's so much that is similar, and these countries are all pretty close together. So the relationship between the English and Danes changed tremendously from the early period. It's fascinating the way, and as I said, to this day, you can sort of pinpoint on a map the place names, kind of give it away where the majority of the Danish settlement was. You can see that very much in the place names, because it reflects, you know, the difference in the language.
It's a big messy story, and it's all tangled up together. So, but something that nobody believes me when I've said this, so maybe I'm wrong, but it was my understanding that, like, Anglo-Saxon women did have a greater level of, I'm trying to think of words other than agency and autonomy. But so how did Anglo-Saxon women, their legal rights, what their options, as it were, compare to contemporary Viking women at the time? So, like, what were do we know? Like,
well, that's a very, very good question. Because the problem we've got is, I mean, you know, everybody says, oh, we shouldn't call it the Dark Ages. And we know so much more than we used to, but in a way we are still limited by, you know, we've got a lot of contemporary records from the period, but not as much as from other periods. And we don't have any contemporary written records for the Viking period, because they weren't Christian and they weren't literate. You know, that we don't have the same, just as we don't for the Anglo-Saxons. It's only when these countries become Christian that they have the scribes, the monks, who can write the histories. So for Viking history, we're really reliant on the much later sagas. So there's that. The English women, we do know, yes, they had a lot of, I mean, for another word, should we say independence? That might be a good one, because they're not necessarily being forced into marriages. There seems to be, in theory, some level of choice about who they marry, on paper at least. They could hold land in their own right. So, you know, this idea of medieval women being the goods and chattels of their husbands, it's not true. What they take into the marriage, they take out. They're holding land in their own right. The Viking women, I'm not so sure. My understanding is that they didn't have quite so much choice. It's not like their fathers are asking them, you know, I've met Björn down the road. Do you want to marry him? No, father, I would rather not. I don't think there's that kind of thing going on. One massive difference, along with the lack of contemporary sources, of course, you know, because of the absence of Christianity, we don't have the Viking women playing the same roles in the religious life and the religious institutions, because they don't exist. So that is one huge difference. So they're not finding their, I mean, I actually think probably being an abbess in that period was a fantastic life. You know, you're a landlady, you're the boss. You know, if you don't want anything to do with marriage, you don't have to. Nobody's going to force you. It's not this idea of, you know, being literally cloistered, because actually most of the monasteries didn't have cloisters in that early period. They're not shut away from society. They're, you know, they have monks that they can talk to as well. So it's not even a single sex situation. But obviously the Viking women would not have had that. So that's one clear difference. I think what we can glean, what we know, as I understand it, Viking women were able to ask for a divorce, um, particularly I think through grounds of abandonment, which must have happened a lot. You know, if the husband went off a Viking. But I also, and I'm nowhere near an expert on the Vikings, I have to say that, but I do believe that Viking women were not allowed in courts. I think that was for men. But we do have evidence that Anglo-Saxon women could go to court. And famously, I spoke about King Edgar, this king in the 10th century. He was quite famous for having quite a few marriages and liaisons. But his last wife, amongst other things, was accused of murder a few times and poison and witchcraft, which was all a little bit. I don't agree with that. I don't think that's true. But what we do know is that she was actually an advocate for a lady in a lawsuit, and she is described as I'm not entirely sure of the pronunciation, but I think it should be foraspreaker, so a for speaker, as in speaking for someone. So, you know, literally an advocate. So she gives evidence and, you know, in support of this woman's case. And we do have descriptions of women taking men to court who've taken their land that belongs to them and they want it back. So I think that's possibly one major difference, is that women do have access to the law courts. I don't know anything, I have to be honest, I don't know anything about whether Viking women were entitled to own land in their own right, but we certainly know that English women were. But I think ultimately the societies are very similar. They're essentially, if they're not fighting, you know, I mean, there's a lot of fighting going on, but everybody is doing the same kind of job. They're living off the land. So we've got textile production, probably in both cultures, it's maybe the women who are mainly responsible for that. But in both societies, you're going to get women doing crafts and men doing the same crafts. They're all living in very much the same way. I mean, you can even look at the jewelry produced by the cultures, and you can see, you know, there's more similarities than differences. Their languages very similar. You know, the general consensus is that they probably understood each other really quite well. That there's enough similarities between Old English and Old Norse that they would be able to communicate. And because it wasn't all fighting, there was a lot of trade going on as well. So I think probably, apart from that religious thing, which is going to be hugely different, I think probably the life of your average Mercian or Northumbrian woman and your average Danish woman, they're not going to be that dissimilar, really.
Fascinating. Very in-depth answer. I appreciate that. This is a side note, but I did notice that even like the Anglo-Saxon women, if you look at like the meaning of their names, it very much reflects like that they're part of a warrior culture. It's like Hild is battle, I think. And then I don't remember exactly, but like if you look into the name meanings, and it's like you can tell that her dad was a warrior because he named all his daughters war names. And but tying into that, one thing, this isn't just about the Anglo-Saxon period, but just women's history in general, is that there often seems to be this kind of desperation to find warrior women. So I don't know if it's a modern phenomenon. I've certainly noticed that people tend to pay a lot more attention if I can tell them that there's evidence a certain woman participated in warfare. But then they conversely tend to lose interest unless I can prove that she so have you ever noticed this phenomenon, or do you have any thoughts? Oh, you do. Okay. Yes. Well, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. So,
why do you think it is?
Well, I had let's say a lukewarm review for my novel about Aethelflaed because it didn't follow the same narrative as how she's portrayed in The Last Kingdom, and because I didn't have her as a fighting warrior woman. But actually, I can't find any evidence of warrior women in the English kingdoms in this period. there's nothing in the written sources. And not only that, we do have written evidence that certainly the royal and noble children were educated, and particularly Aethelflaed and her siblings. We know this because her father had a Welsh monk, I think he might actually been a bishop, in Alfred's court writing Alfred's biography. So this is a very contemporary source. And he does talk about the nature and the level of the children's education. And we hear that the boys are taught to fight, but not the girls. And Alfred's son Edward, we know his daughters were educated, but it's the standard what you would expect. You know, they're taught needlework and embroidery, and you get the impression that the royal women are brought up to you know, as throughout the ages, to learn how to run a household. So if the women are fighting, I'd love to know where they're learning to do that, because there's no written evidence whatsoever. And if we look particularly at Aethelflaed's life, what we have got is a portion of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle known as the Mercian Register, and that's written in Mercia by Mercians and very much championing her. It says she sent an army into Wales to avenge a bishop's death. Now, in my novel, I decided to send her with them because I thought otherwise all the action's happening off stage. But in reality, I don't think she went. You know, it's very specific. She sent the army. She took Derby and lost 4 thanes who were dear to her. But even so, it's not crystal clear that she was leading that army. And I suspect that she was there, but I don't think she was doing the fighting. And I can't find anything in the written records to support this idea of warrior women. So there was, if we turn to the archaeological evidence, there was a grave discovered in Mercia. The skeleton was buried so with grave goods. So this is pre-Christian, because we don't tend to get grave goods after the conversion period, with a shield and a spear and a head wound. And because of what was found in the grave, initially they thought it must be a male. But when the skeleton was re-examined, it was a female. But we don't have any context. There is the famous Viking, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, I think it's Birka warrior, who was most definitely female. But it's not enough. For my view, it's not enough at the moment. That the very small amount of archaeological evidence we have, and we don't have any context really for that Mercian burial, and it's like 5th, 6th century. So, you know, can we say that 400 years before Aethelflaed, you know, times change? So for me, it's not enough. I don't think there were warrior women. So why do we want them? I think perhaps it's almost a sort of a romantic idea, or, you know, it's more exciting if they're fighting, and it kind of gives them equality if they're fighting. But I prefer to think of it being equity. I think they are living incredibly interesting lives, very powerful lives, but in a different way. So they are wielding influence in a sort of complementary way to what the men are doing. We've got so many instances of wives literally whispering in their husbands' ears and influencing policy in that way. And I just think they were doing a great job of living their own lives. I don't think they needed to go out and fight. I think particularly for the very high profile women, it wouldn't make sense. I mean, famously, King Penda in the 7th century seemed to spend half his life up in Northumbria fighting the Northumbrians. He left his wife in charge at home. So they're not necessarily fighting, they're doing everything else. You know, I'm tempted to say, you know, plus ça change. You know, they're staying at home, they're looking after everything, because life isn't just about fighting wars, even though it sounds like it and it took up a lot of time. Somebody's got to make sure the harvest is gathered in, you know. So I think that the women have power in different ways. It makes no sense to me that if your king's on the battlefield, then your queen is too. Why? That's strategically really a bad move. you know. So I'm not convinced, but I think it's just this idea, isn't it? It's exciting, and oh yeah, well, whatever men can do, women can do, and yeah, I get that, but I think they were living a different life, you know, and doing just as good a job in different ways.
I was, what was it? When I can't remember if it was when I read your blog post or I was reading. It was probably both in your blog post and this, but you spend so much time explaining like why you don't think Aethelflaed was a warrior, and I'm like, oh, she's definitely gotten this question. Like you have such detailed citation. I was like, oh, this has definitely come up before. So,
Yeah, I did gave a talk last year just about that, you know, was she a queen and was she a warrior? And I thought, well, okay, I'm really going to investigate this thoroughly, and I'm just going to see what I can find. You know, is there any evidence of women warriors? And nope, I can't find anything. I'm sorry. Doesn't mean it's not there, but we have yet to find it. That's the thing.
this I grew up with like Xena Warrior Princess, and so like I love that. But as I have learned more, it struck me that it's almost like it's almost misogynistic to say, okay, this woman needs to act exactly like the men in her time period, otherwise she doesn't count. And I'm like, well, you've just circled back around to misogyny now. So um, maybe we should stop and think.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect illustration right there. Yeah, we should stop thinking of equality and think of equity. You know, that we shouldn't think that these women were or had to be the same. They're not. You know, they have a different role. They're doing different jobs, and why not? You know, they were leading countries. They were ruling countries. A lot of times it's the mothers of the kings who are the power behind the throne, and that's a really good place to be. You know, just it makes no sense to me that they were out there on the battlefield. But you know, somebody might dig up something tomorrow that proves me wrong. So
Hey, but anything could happen. But thank you. That I appreciate that answer. When I going back to whether or not Ethelflaed was a queen. So when I started looking into this time period, I realized that a lot of terms that we use now don't necessarily have the same meaning for this time period. So like the word queen. So there's the difference of like, I think this did come up in your blog post as well, where it's like, do we count like the level of power or do we count like the title Regina? So can you explain a little bit more about what the title of queen meant or didn't mean in the Anglo-Saxon period, and like how can we define it now? So like so was Ethelflaed a queen? Like how do we answer this?
It's really difficult. It is difficult because I think it meant different things to different people at different times. So we've got, I mean, queen is derived from an Anglo-Saxon word, quen, which is Cwen. They didn't have a Q. But quen, queen, it can mean queen. It can also mean woman. It can also mean wife. So, you know, again, context is all. With female rulers, I think it's really complicated because you've got this weird situation where you've got wives of kings who are called Regina in the documents, but obviously that's a Latin word. So mainly what we look at there is the charters, so grants of land and things, which are then witnessed by everyone who was there and given their descriptors. So you've got Rex and Regina and then all the noblemen and the abbots or whoever were there. But a lot of kings' wives didn't witness any charters. So if we're looking at that as a means of status, it doesn't work. I mean, Alfred the Great's wife famously didn't witness a single charter, or certainly not any that have survived. She wasn't called queen. She was remembered as the Lady of the English. And lady is so much more than you would perhaps immediately think. It's carrying a lot of weight. And of course, Aethelflaed was Lady of the Mercians. She wasn't queen. but I don't think it really matters. And the Welsh and the Irish annals that wrote about her, they called her a queen. Presumably they didn't have another word for it. I think ultimately it's probably more of a, it's a question of the job, as you say, is more important than the job title. I mean, there's a famous story from Asa, that monk at Alfred the Great's court, and he said there was a reason why the wives of kings in Wessex weren't called queen, and it was all to do with a Mercian lady, a daughter of King Offa, in fact, who was married to the West Saxon king. It's a fantastic story. I'll just run through it really quickly. Apparently, she was very, very jealous of her husband's noblemen, so she tried to poison one of them, and she accidentally poisoned the king as well. So she had to flee to the continent, and she ended up in Charlemagne's court, and then she died in disgrace. It's a tragic story, and because she was such an evil, depraved woman, Asa says that's the reason that West Saxon wives were no longer called queen. But it's not true, because we've got charters from after her time, but in Asa's lifetime, where we have got a wife of a king in Wessex being styled Regina in the charter. So it's not true. I think that story was written for other reasons. I actually believe that king in question, although he was a West Saxon king, I think he was a Mercian, and I think nobody wanted to be reminded of that. I think also Alfred had a little bit, well, Alfred's son had trouble from the descendants of Alfred's brother who'd been king, and it was a queen on that side of the family who was styled Regina, and I think they also wanted to downplay that and reduce any claims from that side of the family. So there's a lot going on, but ultimately at the end of the day, I think it is about the job. I think it's semantics, really, whether we're calling people queen. There is one document that actually calls Aethelflaed's husband a king. There's only one, but he is named in a regnal list. But everywhere else, he's just called an ealdorman. He's obviously a very high status ealdorman. But this title, the Lord and Lady of the Mercians, it's more than just a standard lord. And as I say, Aethelflaed's mother was Lady of the English. That's a big old title, that. So it's, yeah, I think lady, queen, kind of interchangeable. But it's very difficult to pin down.
It does become kind of a trope. Like by the time you get to the end of this book, it's like all the women who had like no evidence of anything bad in their lifetime, and then after they die, there are these stories of them being murderesses and poisoners and witches, and it's like this again.
Yeah.
It's like, do we have anything new?
I think a lot of that is that a lot of these stories came from the slightly later, the Anglo-Norman chroniclers, who A, loved to gossip, and B, were writing in a different time. Whereas I say, attitudes, and again, they're still all churchmen writing these histories, and attitudes to, the church attitudes towards women had changed slightly. So yeah, it becomes a whole other story in these poor women's cases.
It was like if I had a nickel for every time. But so this, I don't know how to tie this question in, but I really want to touch on it. You do have another very deep, for everyone watching, her blog is a wealth of information. So there's basically like each post is like almost a book by itself. You touch on it in this book, and you have a very detailed blog post about high profile Anglo-Saxon women who initiated divorce on their own. And that is not something I have ever heard about in this period before. So can you tell us a bit about that, about these cases we know of, and misconceptions you might have seen around divorce in the Dark Ages, quote unquote?
Well, I think it probably would surprise a lot of people that it even existed, because, it goes back to this idea that the women were just chattels, were just the property of their husband, and that's very much not the case. The high profile women who left their husbands went to nunneries, but it wasn't a question of, get thee to a nunnery. They went off to found the abbeys, establish them, and in many cases became the first abbess. I think in towards the later period, some pressure might have been brought to bear by the kings. Um, Somebody once said that the 10th century kings were sort of serial monogamists. They went through quite a number of wives, and it's not always clear whether these wives were still living at the time of the next marriage, or whether they had been, they'd gone to a nunnery, but we don't know whether that was of their own accord. Um, it's not always even a question of, oh, well, you haven't provided me with any children, because some of them had, produced, in one case, about 8 children before she went off to a nunnery. And it may just be that it was a decision, I've done what I need to do. Here are all your children. I'm off now, and I do see that as a plausible scenario that the women were choosing. So the blog post that I think you're talking about, I mentioned 3 specific women, and one of them, Aethelflaed, she was married to a Northumbrian king, and then she ran away. And again, there's lots of later stories about how she ran away, and there were divine floods that stopped her husband getting to her, and he was chasing her. And I don't think that's true. I think it was an amicable divorce based on mutual loathing. She was 10 years older than him. There's a lovely story that St. Wilfrid persuaded her. Apparently she'd hung on to her chastity, her virginity throughout her first marriage, and he persuaded her to do that throughout her second as well. I'm always a bit suspicious of these kind of stories, because I'm like, who's writing this down? Who's telling someone for posterity, their most intimate secrets? But anyway, I think what's more likely is that she was 10 years older than him. The marriage didn't produce any children. So I think there was probably, hey, husband, I'd quite like to get out of here and go and build an abbey somewhere. Is that okay with you? And he said, yeah, fine, off you trot. I think that was probably the scenario. What's going on with ordinary women? We don't know. So I have got a little quote here somewhere. Yes, so we don't have much on divorce, but we do have bits on marriage. And I just want to quote, if we've got time, something about marriage and then something about divorce. So we've got a document, we're not entirely sure of the dates, it was probably late 10th century, and it says, if a man wishes to betroth a maiden or a widow, and it so pleases her and her kinsman. So, she's obviously being allowed to choose. And the bridegroom is to announce what he grants her in return for her acceptance of his suit. And what he grants her, if she should live longer than he, then it's right that she should be entitled to half the goods, and to all if they have a child together, unless she marries again. So this all sounds very modern and very civilized, and it's giving her a little bit of financial security and, some kind of say in, who she marries. And then we've got a little glimpse from earlier. So that was from the 10th century, but this is from the 7th. And this is much more specifically about, annulling that marriage. And it says, if a wife wishes to depart with her children, she shall have half the goods. And there's compensation if the husband wants to keep the children. So if he says he wants to keep the children, then she gets something in return for that. If she doesn't bear a child, the father's relatives shall have the goods and the mourning gift. So this is the gift literally given the morning after the wedding, given by the husband to the woman, and that's hers, whatever. So there's a law case later on where a woman has sold her mourning gift, and she says, I'm entitled to do that because it was mine to do what I wanted with it. So, the relatives get the land and the property if there's no children. I mean, that makes sense, but it's her relatives. Nothing's going back to the husband. So what she gets, what she gets from the marriage and what she takes into the marriage, she's taking that out as well. And if he wants to keep her children, then he's got to compensate her, which is vastly different from this impression we get of later periods where, your medieval woman, she can't divorce, and even if she did, she'd have to leave her children behind. I mean, this is something that I read about so often. But it's clearly not happening there. And like I said, this is the 7th century we're talking about here. The caveat to that is that there's an awful lot of talk about a man buying a woman, purchasing a wife. But I was reading somewhere a while ago, and I can't remember who made the point, but there is some dispute about this verb to buy, that it may not mean what we think it means. But yet here we've got, in the 7th century, so the 600s, a woman being allowed to walk out of a marriage and take her children with her. I think that's probably quite surprising to most people, because it's not the impression you have of a medieval woman. So yeah, it's there. I'm not saying they had fantastic lives and acres and acres of freedom, but they owned their land. They could keep their land. They could give it. Oh, and we've got surviving wills where women are granting land, bequeathing it to other women, and not just necessarily in order to build a monastery or anything. So they've got lands and they've got goods, and they're getting rid of them. They're selling them. It's theirs to do with what they will. So it's amazing that they had a lot more rights, I think, than most people assume.
So deeply fascinating. I was reading that. I think you do touch on it in this book, where if she leaves, she gets to take her children with her. And I'm like, oh, well, that wasn't until I think maybe the past 60 years here in America became the norm.
Yeah.
That's their divorce law was ahead of ours. So
it strikes me as incredible that although this is probably the vast majority of women's lives were miserable, but we get these glimpses that there's so much more going on. We've got a fortress named after a woman. Bamborough, Bevenberg, is named after a woman called Bebba. We know no more than that, but she must have been a powerful woman. We've got Aethelflaed fighting. We've got Cynethryth with her own coins. Yeah, these are just one or two. But when you think that nothing really changed until the Tudor era, and I really don't want to get modern political, but I will just make the point: we still haven't had a woman president in the United States, and we've had a few female prime ministers in our country, but these are still, they're extraordinary events when they happen, and yet they were happening with almost as much frequency way back then. It's incredible to think that these women were doing this, and yet walking out of their marriages with their children, with no comeback. No, the men have no claim on those children. Whereas in the slightly later medieval period, my understanding is that the children belonged to the husband. And I think even in the Victorian era, I was reading something recently about a woman who would not divorce her husband, even if she could, because she would lose her children. The children belonged to the man. And clearly this isn't the case back in the 7th century, which is, it's amazing.
Progress isn't a straight line. It's more like this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So this is slightly a change of topic, but you have a book coming out in February, Murder in Anglo-Saxon England. I was so excited when I saw this. I'm going to pre-order it as soon as they allow Americans to do it. But I do have a few questions about it. So it's Murder in Anglo-Saxon England, Justice, Weregild, and Revenge. So can you tell us some basics about what was the justice system in Anglo-Saxon England? So probably didn't have modern courts, but what was it, first of all?
It was really a compensation system. So again, it's only when we get Christianity coming in that the laws get written down, and we have a few surviving, but we have massive gaps. We have nothing, for example, for the 8th century, and some of the kingdoms we don't have any written law codes at all. But what we do have is quite interesting. And so the justice system, later on there were courts. So Sometimes there were private courts, so that the local noblemen were responsible, and there'd be laws saying things like, if you catch a thief on your land, it's your responsibility to hang him. But essentially, it's a system where, and it's not unique to the English. I know for a fact that the Welsh had this system, and I believe the Vikings did too, where everybody was worth a certain amount. And instead of there being actual punishments for most crimes, you had to pay. And you paid depending on your status and that of your victim. So a slave, for example, and yes, the Anglo-Saxons did have slaves. Almost all cultures in that period did. A slave was not entitled to anything, but if you damaged or stole or killed a slave, then you had to pay compensation. So you're not going to prison, you're not being executed, you're paying a fine, essentially. So it's a fine-based system of justice, and the amount depends on the value. And that's basically it. It seems to be a leftover from the Germanic culture, where the Angles and the Saxons and all the rest of them originally came from. And that's pretty much it. We have a lot of written law codes, as I say, a lot for the 7th century, from Kent and from Wessex, nothing for the 8th century, nothing from Mercia, nothing from Northumbria. So we sort of assume that the laws were similar in all the kingdoms, but we can't be certain because, as I say, we don't know. But yeah, there's lots of interesting stuff in those law codes. It's fascinating to read.
I think you kind of answered this, but what can you explain? Can you explain what weregild was, who paid it, who they paid it to, and we kind of already touched on this, but how much they were supposed to pay?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So you've got various layers. I mean, obviously the king is the most important at all, and you have to pay much more if you do anything to disturb the king's peace. So, if you start a fight on his land in his hall, you're going to pay much more. I did actually look beforehand to see if I could find a sort of breakdown. It's hard to come across a list because a lot of the law codes are so specific. But I did find one from the 7th century. I've got it here. This is actually about if you hurt a Welshman. But it gives you an idea. So if your crime is against a Welsh slave, that's 50 shillings. So this is from the 7th century. Now, obviously, that's not being paid to the slave. A landless Welshman, 60. A landless Welshman with half a hide of land, 80. The son of a Welsh rent payer, 100. The Welsh rent payer or landed Welshman with one hide, 120. A Welsh horseman in the king's service, 200. And then a landed Welshman with 5 hides of land, 600. So you can see that the top of that, the landed Welshman with 5 hides is 10 times more valuable than the landless Welshman. And so the same principle applied. You've even got levels within the aristocracy or the clerics, the religious men. It's all ranked according to your worth. So that gives you a rough idea. A hide as a unit of land that a family can live off. So that's the standard way of apportioning land. So yeah, it's really interesting how it works. The one thing I would say is that weregild is one thing, but a thief, he's not getting away with paying a fine. He's dying. There's this theft is in some ways more important than murder, which is something that I discovered when I was researching for the book. And theft nearly always carries the death penalty. So that they can't just wave a purse of money and get away with it. So that's interesting.
That is very fascinating. I guess in a subsistence culture it would be a different value system, but I'm very excited for the book. But like the book, it talks about revenge. So do we think weregild typically precluded a victim's family or loved ones from getting payback, or like do we have instances where somebody goes and gets revenge, or
yeah,
do we know?
Both?
Okay,
both. So the general thinking is that this system is designed to stop fights escalating. And some of the law codes are so specific. There's a list of injuries, and just if I could just read out a few because they are so specific. So if seizing or pulling by the hair takes place, 50 sciatas as compensation. If the exposure of bone occurs, the aggressor shall pay as compensation 3 shillings. If the outer part of the skull gets broken, it's 10 shillings. If both the outer and the inner part are broken, that's 20 shillings. So these are really, really detailed. It's incredible. And you think, why? And it's so that everybody knows what they can expect to have to pay if these injuries occur. And so, the levels. And I think the idea is very much to stop the feud escalating, to stop the victim's kinsmen coming after the perpetrator and dispensing their own justice. But it didn't always work. And I've got quite a big section in the book about the blood feud and the fact that it didn't always work. And it's really interesting because there's also a definition of feud and what that actually meant. But essentially, this justice system is designed in a weird kind of way. It sounds so violent, doesn't it? You just think all these laws are made because people are just running around biting each other's ears off. And, if you bite 2 ears off, you're going to pay more than if you just bite one. This terrible, violent society. But actually, it's more like, if you do this, this is what's going to happen. You're going to have to pay a lot of money. And obviously, if you can't pay, then you're in big trouble because your family's going to have to pay, or your lord is going to have to pay. So he's not going to be happy with you. So, hey, how about we don't do it in the first place? That's really the kind of thinking. And later on, there are laws against kinsmen coming to a perpetrator's aid. Again, designed to stop anything, A, happening and B, escalating. So although it sounds pretty primitive, it's actually quite a clever system, and it does seem in the main to have worked. But then on the other hand, I wouldn't have been able to write a book about murder if it had been entirely successful. So,
Is there anything else we can expect from the book or we should look forward to in the book?
There's lots of grisly detail, but just to go back to what we were saying about the later Anglo-Norman chroniclers, they did like to embellish all their tales. So what I tried to do, it had occurred to me for a while, particularly writing blog posts and books, that there are a lot of murder stories. And I thought, well, okay, firstly, how many? And what exactly is going on? So a lot of the earlier ones are quite simple cases of king killing because somebody wants to be in charge, as the kingdoms were forming and expanding. And so it's a power struggle and it was nasty. But then you get all sorts of other stories. So, the women, child murders, poisonings. And I thought, okay, why? Firstly, what are the sources for these stories? Are they true? Let's see if we can check the veracity. And then let's see if we can understand why it was happening and why it was being written about in that way. And how interested was this society in murder and how prevalent was it? And so there is a lot about the laws at various points. Because as I said earlier, capital punishment is really not a big thing except for theft. And then I did find that seems to be true throughout history, that, even the Victorians, they'd hang you for stealing. It's a big thing, theft and violence against property is almost more of a concern than violence against people. So that was interesting. But yeah, there's lots of grisly stuff. I've done it chronologically, but there's also some thematic chapters as well. There's a whole chapter on poor churchmen getting murdered for various reasons. And there's a lovely one I really love, a death by scissors, which is
oh my.
That's a favourite of mine. That's a great story.
This is another thing where it's like I keep reading weregild shows up randomly in a bunch of books I've read, and I'm like, I want to learn more about weregild, and oh, there's no books on it. So now there's going to be a book on it.
Yeah, I mean, it is a really interesting thing, and I have touched on how the laws came into being, and the also the reasoning behind writing those laws down and how that came about, and what it meant, and later on we've got lovely, and I've mentioned in the book that Shakespeare really missed a trick not writing about this era, because you've got great families not going to war but just murdering each other, and the kings seemingly turning a blind eye, and in some cases ordering these killings to happen. So it really is quite, Shakespearean, fascinating. And the way these murder stories change over the years, and the sort of rationale behind the reporting of them, and just the nature of the crimes as well, and how that compares to the law, and what the average man on the street, as it were, was being subjected to, and how the nobility were actually getting away with these murders. So yeah, it turned out to be much more complex than I thought it would be. But it sounds really awful and bloodthirsty, but I did really enjoy it.
Sounds like I said, I'm so excited. So I will find. I was like trying to figure out, like, maybe I can just have my UK friend buy it and then mail it to me. So I'm gonna find a way to get it. But that comes to the end of my questions. Like, where can people find you online?
So if I've got a website, it's anniewhiteheadauthor.co.uk. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky. If you search Annie Whitehead author, it should come up. If you just search my name, you'll probably find a very famous jazz trombonist who goes by the same name. But if you do Annie Whitehead author, you should find
me. Her name comes up first, but your website comes up first.
Oh, that's good to know.
So, well, thank you so much. I'm definitely hoping that Aethelfest becomes an annual event. So,
I hope so too.